Hello and welcome to the Common Weal Policy Podcast. I'm Craig Dale, I'm the Head of Policy and Research at Common Weal, and this week my special guest is Professor Mark Smith. Mark is a Professor of Social Work at the University of Dundee, but previous to his academic work, which is long and varied, he was a practitioner and manager in residential childcare. He's also a member of the Common Weal Care Reform Working Group and has just last week published a paper for Common Weal called What is Care?, which attempts to answer probably the most fundamental question that you have to think about when you're building something like a national care service. So we're going to talk about that this week. Hello, Mark. How are you?
I'm good, thanks, Craig.
Now, we were just talking just before we came on this, and you told a wee story there that I didn't know about you, despite having worked with you for over a year now. But this notion of care is something that's not just something that's a part of your academic life, your professional life, but something that's very personal to you as well. Can you tell us a bit more about it?
Yeah, I mean, I left professional social work practice 21 years ago now, but throughout that period, I've still been very heavily involved in caring in different sort of ways. But over that whole piece, we have looked after disabled children on a respite basis, myself and my family. And over the past 4.5, 5 years, we've been foster carers for an asylum seeking now refugee boy. And like everyone my age, or many people my age who are lucky enough to have parents who have lived this long, then you're confronted with other caring responsibilities. In my case, it was for my dad who had Alzheimer's. So this notion of care is a sort of daily experience for myself, for my family. And given my academic background, I sort of make links between, what I hear about care and what I experience of care in my own sort of life, and try and marry the two.
So, as we said, you published this paper last week that takes this very fundamental question, and we're actually not going to ask that question first in this podcast because I want to kind of lead up to it and talk around it before we dive into it. But if we want to build a national care service, or if we even just want to continue with the care sector that we have just now, it's a question that needs to be answered. What is care? How was that question answered in the past in Scotland?
I don't think it ever has been. And I think it's to do with the nature of care being something that is so everyday, that we all experience care from the moment of birth to, hopefully, to the moment of sort of death. We do it within our own families. And it's historically been very devalued. It's very often been relegated to something which is menial, domestic, very often women's work. And in all of that, we have really failed, I think, to address the idea of what care is. It's only in the last, maybe since about the 80s, that people have started to explore what care is. I mean, I think there are previous sort of considerations from a religious perspective, certainly, but it's only maybe from the 80s that people have started to explore what care is. But I'm not sure that we have in the public sector. We take it for granted. We have old people's homes, we have care homes, whatever else. From 2000 onwards, we have had legislation to regulate care. And yet, one of the things that struck me about that, and it continues to strike me about policy engagement with the idea of care, is that it doesn't engage with care. We want to regulate care, but we don't know what care is actually. But now we want to have a national care service, and still we don't really know what care is.
It also strikes me, and it's something that you mentioned in your paper, that quite often when we talk about care, both in the last few decades and even now in contemporary politics, it's often framed around cost priorities. It's not really what is care or what kind of care do we need. It's how much does it cost and how do we pay for it?
Yeah, it's about a service to be delivered, and to be delivered in a managerial frame in the most cost-effective way as can be. I mean, I'm not convinced that it is actually. But that's a driving motivation. So it's about sort of regulating care, it's about delivering care, and it's about trying to do so in as cost-effective a way, and also in as risk-averse a way as we can get away with.
So we have now seen the Scottish Government started to think about this in terms of the National Care Service. This could be one of the things that is built out of the crisis that has been the COVID pandemic. We have seen the Feely review into adult social care, and we have just submitted our publication to the Scottish Government's consultation on a National Care Service. Have these questions started to come up? Is the Scottish Government changing their thinking on what care is?
I don't think they are in the slightest. And at one level, I can understand that, because I think if you've been immersed in care on a day-to-day basis, or managing care, or trying to regulate care, then you deal with what you know. I mean, one of the benefits for me in terms of being able to be an academic is to be able to step back and ask those questions while still being engaged with this idea of care, or the practice of care, on a daily basis. But for most people who are charged with policy making and care, then it is about these questions about how do we do it as efficiently, as effectively, and as economically as possible, because that has been the defining sort of mantra. And very few people, I mean, I think there's been some work, fair bit of work, mostly in health actually, around the notion of care. Social work as a profession hasn't actually engaged sufficiently with the idea of care. It's looked to ideas of empowerment and help, and hasn't necessarily engaged with the idea of care. So yeah, I don't think that the current proposals go beyond this focus on service delivery, and they're framed in the kind of neoliberal managerial frame which has surrounded most policy making for the past 20, 30 years, perhaps more.
And that was certainly my experience reading through the consultation, which was a huge consultation, 96 questions over 140 pages, covering a variety of topics, but with no, to my mind anyway, no real direction to them. It was a bit scattergun throughout, and it was certainly, while I didn't do much of the work, that was down to you and the rest of the care working group. I certainly didn't get the impression that there was much thought beyond, what could change. So it's maybe something that's hopefully something that can be picked up as this consultation analyses its results and starts to build that National Care Service. Common Weal are certainly going to keep engaged in that process. One thing, though, that the Scottish Government has been doing quite a lot of, not just in care, but in other areas of policy, is trying to embed the concept of human rights into Scots law and take a rights-based approach to a lot of policies. We have the rights of the child that was quite controversial over the last few weeks. We have the right to food, the right to respite from for carers, and various other rights being embedded into policy. Is this the correct approach?
No, I mean, I don't think for a minute that it is. I think there's a number of problems with it. One, I think it goes back to that neoliberal way of thinking, which identifies people not as persons in relation, which a philosophical sort of perspective might actually start from, but as autonomous individuals with rights and rights to enter into contracts. And within that kind of way of thinking, then lawyers become the sort of predominant profession, if you like. And I'm not sure law can actually accommodate care, or rights can accommodate care. I would go further and say that good care will respect people's rights, and just saying that people have rights will not actually, or rights to care even, will not actually ensure that they get that, because care is not a legalistic concept. It's a relational concept that can only be actually realized through interaction with other people, and rights cannot guarantee that.
Mm. This was something I'll link to an article by Robin McAlpine from last week who spoke a bit about this. It's particularly picked up that point about the right to respite for carers, given that caring isn't an obligation. You do already have the right to walk away. Now, you might not want to do that. You have other moral obligations and other relationship obligations that draw you into caring. But you don't have you're not legally forced to do the job. But there's also the aspect that these rights must come with responsibilities. Who do you sue if your rights are breached? So from that aspect, when we say we're not in favour of a strict rights-based approach, this doesn't mean that we're against the concept of human rights per se, does it?
I think that rights are a starting point in terms of setting down some norms that we would like to see apply in human relations, but they're only a starting point, and they're insufficient in terms of taking us much further in terms of how we actually relate with one another, because potentially they see us relating, as I say, as autonomous individuals through contractual means with some sort of right to redress if that contract is breached. But only some people have that right to redress as well, because you need to be able to pursue it through a court. And if you don't have the wherewithal, whether it's sort of intellectual or financial, to do that, then just telling you've got rights is pretty meaningless.
I'm always reminded of Andy Whiteman's famous book when talking about land reform, The Poor Had No Lawyers, which this explains that concept as succinctly as you can, and the same applies here as well. If you can't afford to protect your rights when they are breached, then how do you fix it?
Yeah. I mean, I do think that the whole rights discourse is based on a particular way of seeing the world, which is a sort of through a legal ontology, a legal way of understanding the world. And one of the ironies for me is my background was in residential childcare, and they started to introduce rights perspectives in like the 1980s, 1990s. And I think there was a real downside to it, because I think it disempowered staff in terms of their ability to care for kids. They became fearful, and they stood off kids, and they didn't touch kids lest it be seen as breaching a kid's right. They didn't hug kids. Now, I'm not saying that everybody should. I was never a hugger. I didn't get into some of this sort of physical stuff, because that wasn't the way I interacted with kids. But some kids looked for it, and some staff were brilliant at it. So again, these things are messy, and they need to be sort of individualized as well. But the irony I was going to come to was that we now have some of the children's advocacy organisations saying that kids don't get love in residential childcare. And one of the reasons I would suggest that they don't experience that kind of close emotional contact is because we have framed relationships between adults and kids in terms of rights. And that detracts, I think, from the ability to show love. So now we have some of the children's rights organisations saying kids need love, and that is pretty insubstantial as well, because you can't mandate that. You can't say go and love that kid. I mean, I think that love can emerge, or some sort of emotional sort of contact, some emotional relationship can emerge and does emerge from caring, but you can't mandate it. So just to demand it is just another aspect of a sort of rights discourse, I think.
So as we go forward, the Scottish Government will set up this national care service, but if it doesn't ask this question, what is care, and if it doesn't answer it, or if it answers it improperly, what will happen to that national care service? What kind of system could we end up with?
An interesting piece, I think, that was circulated on the Common Weal chat this morning, and it was suggesting that basically what we'll get is a commissioning service. We'll get a service which says we need to provide a service, we'll put that out to tender, we'll get the cheapest, arguably most cost-effective tender, and we'll have done our bit. We'll have provided care, but you won't necessarily have provided care at all. It just sort of keeps a private sector industry going a lot of the time. It fails to see care as a common good, something that we need to actually, and I'm not saying that there's no role for, I don't think local authorities were necessarily the best providers of care either, but I think in principle, then it should be local authorities that task is located with, in the sense that there is some sort of democratic accountability within that. And if local authorities were properly resourced and had the ability, if you like, to be imaginative in providing care, then I think that that's where it should be located. But that wider question you were asking, I always think in a philosophical sense about a telos, about an end point. And, what is the end point of this National Care Service? It seems to me it's about trying to get the Scottish Government out of a hole that COVID has created, which has really just accentuated pre-existing problems anyway. There was problems in the care service anyway. But there's no sort of wider aspiration. It talks about your care service, it helps people thrive, but there's no sense of how you get there or what thriving means. And again, there is a literature, people can have conversations about what would a good life look like? And that's what we should be aspiring towards, some notion of the good life. And to get there, we need to actually have conversations about what the good life is. What is this idea of human flourishing, if you like, and how do we get there? Not just this assumption that we've got to provide care, so we'll try and do it as effectively as we can and try and get politicians off the hook.
Now that we've sort of set up the background for why you have approached this question and the background in which the care landscape currently is in Scotland, Mark, what is care? Could you take us through your paper from what brought you into this, your thinking? Yeah,
I suppose my academic interest was sort of piqued by a book from 2002. It was on children's services. In fact, it wasn't on children's services because the title of the book was From Children's Services to Children's Spaces. And the idea, I think, was that we needed to look beyond service land to think about a more philosophical rationale for what it is that we do, in this case in children's care, but more broadly in care. And it introduced a number of philosophical perspectives. One being a sort of ethic of care, care ethics, feminist ethics, which emerged from the 80s onwards. And one of the sort of seminal writers in care ethics, Joan Tronto, identifies care as a practice rather than a set of sort of principles, if you like. It's something that you do. Another way of thinking about it would be it's not a technical, rational, or instrumental task. It's not like, an engineering task. It's very much relational, it's practical and moral. So in many senses, it's about getting your hands dirty. Some of the care ethics literature differentiates between caring about and caring for. And we can all say that we care about, that we're caring people, and we throw a couple of quid at somebody who's begging in the street, or we subscribe to a charity. And what Mel Noddings would say is that's can evince a sort of benign neglect. It's salving our conscience. But actually, to care properly, you need to get your hands dirty, you need to care for. So there's a sort of personal, relational dimension to caring. And I think very often we expect other people to do it, but most of us do it in some capacity in our own lives anyway. And it's about taking that into a more professional realm. What is it to care? And as I say, it's a practice rather than a set of principles. I think Virginia Held says that we need to move from rights and rules to relationships and responsibilities. So this notion that we're responsible for the other, we are our brother's keeper, our sister's keeper, and how do we sort of carry out that duty, if you like? But care's more than a duty as well. It's something which we are called to. And we don't do it just out of a sense of obligation. We do it because I think as human beings, there is a more innate sentiment, moral sentiment that drives what we do. And that's evident actually in a lot of the Scottish Enlightenment philosophy.
Yeah. So if we think about just the political dimension of this, is how do we set up a national care service to embed that kind of relationship notion into it?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've moved too quickly. We've sort of moved to the solution before identifying what it is that we want to solve, if you like. So I really think we need some sort of conversation which brings in these wider perspectives about what care is or could be, before we start setting up the systems that we imagine might actually deliver it. And I think that when you look at some of the big sort of policy breakthroughs, if you like, the National Health Service in Scotland, Kilbrandon deliberated for about 3 years before he came out with the report, and looked far and wide, looked to Europe, looked to expert opinion, a broad range of expert opinion, and then synthesised some of that in a report, which I think stands as the phrase, the test of time. I think there was something pretty substantial about that. When you only focus on the delivery aspects without knowing what it is that you want to deliver, then I don't know how this care service is currently imagined can actually make a fundamental impact, because it doesn't take into account some of the other things like resources and what do you do if your rights are breached, all of these things. So to base it on rights, I think rights gives a soundbite, but it actually doesn't give a philosophical rationale.
Yeah, that was again kind of my impression when we started getting involved in this project, that you compare something like the Kilbrandon report to the Feely report, for instance, the Feely process. And I'm not going to directly criticise Derek Feely or the people on that committee themselves. They worked within the mandate they were given, and they worked within the timescales they were given. But that commission was over almost before it started. There was very little time for even us to engage with it, never mind them to engage with the wider politic of care.
Yeah. So it's an expedient politics, isn't it? Give us a fix.
Yeah. So that's like my kind of hope of that comes out of this consultation that's going through, is they will take the time to go through it. As we said, there's a huge number of questions, a huge number of issues addressed within it. And I really do hope they take the time to digest them. And I know from speaking to other groups, for example, the Scottish Food Coalition, who I spoke to last week, they were disappointed that food didn't appear at all within that consultation. You think food, that must be pretty fundamental to care, shouldn't it?
Well, I mean, one of the phrases, and I have to confess, it's not mine. I wish it was. It's Hugh Lloyd Richards. He spoke about care being about the art and craft of everyday life. And there's nothing more central to everyday life than food, in terms of, its necessity for sustenance, but also the symbolic value, the communal value that it actually plays in all of our lives. And it's the sheer sort of enjoyment, value that it plays, but the social dimension of eating is absolutely fundamental. And actually, if you don't address that, then what you do is you sanction a system which allows carers to go into somebody's home with a microwavable meal, put it in the microwave, put it on the table, and then leave after 15 minutes because they've got the next person to deliver a microwavable meal to. So some of these deeper anthropological significant events, if you like, are not taken into account in the kind of version of care that we've got. And food ought to be fundamental. And the very fact that we're actually thinking about food as a right is perhaps a bit of an indictment of where we are as a society at the moment.
Yeah, where do you go for your lunch if your right to food is breached?
Well,
never mind who do you sue.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, just one further point on that, and it's the notion, going back to the idea of what care is, and again, some of the literature suggests that it's both an activity and a disposition. So we need to do something, and ideally we need to do something in a sort of very competent way. So if you're getting into manual handling, personal care, you want to do that competently, but you also need a caring disposition. And I think we all know caring people, and we know when we've experienced care, even in sort of medical settings, then we know a caring practitioner. Now, a practitioner might be very technically adept, but not come across as caring. And I think it makes a difference when you've got that additional dimension. So again, we need to think what dispositions we want carers to exhibit. And that leads to questions about qualifications, about identity, all sorts of things about the workforce as well.
So Mark, just as we come to the end of the podcast, I believe you have another paper just published this week as well, somewhere else. Can you mention that?
Yeah, one of my criticisms, if you like, of the lack of ability to deal with care is that we privilege particular groups and professions within society. I've mentioned lawyers. I think another dominant group at the moment is psychologists, or, the notion of psychology generally. I don't want to tar all psychologists because a lot of my friends are psychologists and some psychologists are absolutely brilliant.
My email inbox will fill up if you do. So,
but the notion that everything has to be a psychological problem more than an everyday anthropological problem, sociological problem. And the other paper is questioning another totem, or Scottish Government contemporary totem, and that is trauma. The idea that everybody is traumatised and every worker should look at their work through a trauma-informed lens. And I won't say too much about the paper. It's just been published in the journal Scottish Affairs, but it sort of questions this notion of the psychologization of everyday life, and the notion that sometimes fairly minor events can be considered to be traumatic, and what the consequences of that way of thinking are in terms of taking us or sticking us within the individual, taking us away from some sort of collective understanding of social welfare, and some of the structural impediments rather than the sort of intrafamilial, intra-community sort of things that get in the way of human growth, human flourishing. And those are political questions rather than questions of identifying goodies and baddies within a relational context.
I'll stick a link to that paper and the other works that we've mentioned over the course of the podcast in the description below. People can check them out if they want to read them. Mark, thank you for coming on to the podcast. That's been a great chat, and it has been great working with you over the last year, and just sitting in all the discussions with the care working group. And I'm really looking forward in a few weeks to the publication of the Common Weal blueprint for a national care service. I'm really hoping it can really add to the discussion of what Scotland is trying to build over the next few years. So, yeah, thank you for coming onto the podcast. I'm going to finish up, just as I always do, by saying that Common Weal as an organisation is funded entirely by our donors and supporters, who give an average of £10 a month each. We don't get government money. We don't have corporate sponsors. We don't even have adverts on our website. So everything we do, from the podcast to our policy papers to our wider activism, is entirely possible simply because of the generosity of our supporters. So if you're out there and you're listening to this podcast and you would like to donate and help us produce the next podcast, then we'd greatly appreciate it. So that's it for this week's policy podcast. Thank you once again, Mark. Please folk out there listen to this, share it around, talk about it, send us your views, and come back next week.